So now I want to turn my attention to an approach to algorithmic composition called process music. So we're going to talk about what it is. We're going to look at one of its leading early practitioners, Steve Reich, and we're going to implement a couple of processes ourselves in Python code. In the process, we're going to learn one new thing about Python, which is how to write our own functions rather than just using ones that other people have written. And so I want to look at this quote from Steve Reich in this kind of manifesto that he wrote in the late 60s called Music as a Gradual Process, which really defines this idea of process music and how it's different from what we've been doing up to now. He says, I'm interested in perceptible processes. I want to be able to hear the process happening throughout the sounding music. To facilitate closely detailed listening, a musical process should happen extremely gradually. And so what Reich is saying there, he's reacting in particular against a number of different aesthetic practices that were common at this time, including chance music and stochastic music, where it was very difficult to hear what was going on as a listener, listening to a piece. You couldn't really understand the process that the composer had used to create it. And so Reich was going in the opposite direction here, trying to create music that was extremely clear what the process, what the algorithm was behind it. Because it was an extremely simple algorithm and it unfolded extremely gradually. And so this is something that guided a lot of his early music. But before we look at the examples of his music, I thought I would come up with a simple example of our own. And the idea here was a kind of a musical palindrome. So we have a file that it might be one measure long, and we want to start off by playing just the first 16th note of it. And then we want to play the first 2 16th notes, and then the first 3 16th notes, and the first 4 16th notes, and the first 5, and so on and so forth. So we're playing the whole measure. And then we cut it down 1 16th note at a time. So we play the whole measure except the last 16th note, and except the last 2, and so on and so forth, until we're back at the very end, just down to that single 16th note, like that. And so here's some code that accomplishes that. So let me just walk through how it works. We have our standard import init, set tempo, and statements, and then we're using just this one file. This is the one that we're going to do this kind of palindrome operation on. And then I'm defining a variable that I'm going to use to keep track of where I am in time within the DAW. So I'm going to increment this over and over again every time I put a new sound in. So I'm going to start it at 1, at the beginning of measure 1. And then this loop is going to be my expansion loop. So this is the one that's starting with 1 16th note and gradually building up to the full measure. So I do this 16 times, so 1, 2, 3, and on and on until we get to 16. I'm going to set the duration for this particular iteration to be equal to 0.0625, which is a 16th of a measure, so that's 1 16th note long, times I. So the first time this executes, it'll be 0.0625 times 1, the next time 0.0625 times 2, the next time 0.065 times 3. So we're making this a 16th note longer each time. And then I call fit media to place my sound on track 1 at the position. So initially this is just at measure 1, beat 1. And then I have it last whatever that duration is. So it ends at position plus the duration I calculated. 1 16th note, 2 16th notes, 3 16th notes, etc. And then I increment my position. So I say now position equals position plus duration. So I'm adding my duration to this. So I know that the next time I go through this loop, I will start by placing my next file right where the previous one left off. So they'll always be back to back on my track. So that's how that loop works. And then this next loop here is the second half of the palindrome, where I'm making it compression, where I'm making it shorter and shorter and shorter each time. So the loop is very similar. I just have slightly different loop indices here. So I'm going 0, 1, 2, 3, so on up to 15. And then here where I'm calculating the durations, I'm still multiplying it by 16th note, but I'm doing 16 minus I here. So at first it'll be times 16, so it'll be a full measure, and then it'll be times 15, and then times 14, and so on all the way down to times 1. And then the fit media line is exactly the same, and the position increment line is exactly the same. And then the only other thing I did here was I just put a simple drum loop on track 2. So we'd have some kind of rhythmic reference as we were listening to this. I can play it for you with that muted and with that not muted so you can hear the difference. So now let's take a look at that script inside of EarSketch. So we've got the same script here. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And we can look at it and we can see it. Let me zoom out a little bit so those waveforms are a little bit larger. So here's our palindrome track here. And you can see from those vertical lines how it's starting off very short and getting a larger and larger sound segments, and then going in reverse at the end and getting shorter and shorter again. And then here's our reference beat at the bottom. So first let me just play the palindrome track. I'll go ahead and solo that so you can hear that on its own. Okay, so you could hear how it started off with very short segments, got longer in the middle, and then as the palindrome kind of reversed, it got shorter and shorter towards the end. Now let me go ahead and play this where you can hear the reference beat as well, so you can get a sense of where the meter of the DAW is. And you can hear how this starts off kind of lining up with the DAW, but as the durations of each of these segments changes, it starts getting kind of out of sync with it and pushing against that meter. So let's go back for a second to Steve Reich, and I want to explore a very important idea of his, the guide of these early process pieces called phasing. And phasing actually goes back almost to this idea of beating that we looked at in the very first module of the course. I think, in fact, in the very first video, when we were looking at two sine waves that were slightly out of, they were at slightly different frequencies. One was at 440 hertz and one was at 441 hertz. And so when we played them back together, they got in and out of phase with each other in these regular patterns. So when they were perfectly in phase, they would reinforce each other, and they would kind of double their peaks and troughs. And they were perfectly out of phase, they would cancel each other out perfectly, and we'd end up with silence. And they'd go back and forth and create this pulsing, beating sound that musicians could actually use to tune. So what if we took that idea, but instead of using it to help us tune, or this kind of a phenomenon that exists, what if we slowed it down dramatically so that we had two tape loops or two audio files that were playing back at slightly different speeds? So over the course of 30 seconds or a minute or even longer, they gradually got in and out of phase with each other. And so they had these constantly changing relationships with each other in terms of the counterpoint of how they lined up with each other musically. This is exactly what Reich was doing in his early tape pieces with two reel-to-reel tape decks. And each one actually had literally a loop of tape on it that would play over and over and over again. But the length of those two tape loops was ever so slightly different from each other, so that the tape recorders would get in, and they were identical loops, just slightly different lengths, so they would get gradually in and out of phase with each other over a course of minutes. This was actually something that he came across accidentally, because he was trying to get two tape players to play perfectly in sync with each other, but that turned out to be really hard. And then instead he discovered that the mistake, them not playing in sync, was actually really fascinating musically for him, and expressed this idea of this gradual process that he really wanted to capture. He liked this so much that he actually used this in pieces without technology as well. One of the most famous of those is a piece called Piano Phase, which is for two pianists on two separate pianos. They're playing the same melody. I think it's a 12-note melody, something like that. They're playing it over and over and over again, and they start playing it in perfect synchronization with each other. But then one of them starts playing ever so slightly faster than the other. So they gradually get out of phase until they're exactly one note apart, and then exactly 2 notes apart, exactly 3 notes apart, and so on and so forth. And eventually they come all the way around and they end up in perfect sync with each other again. So what now if we were to try to implement this idea of phasing in EarSketch? How would we do it? The approach is very similar actually to some of the stuff that we're doing with the palindrome. But I do want to introduce this new idea of defining our own function in EarSketch, because this is going to make it much easier for us to do this. So what I have here, we have our typical initialization there, and I'm defining the sound that I want to use for this phasing process, the tape loop, if you will. And here I'm defining my own function. So I start off with the word def, and then I give my function name, and then I give my parameters, track, duration, and pan. So I want to be able to call this function and say, this is the track that I want to put this file on. This is how long I want that file to last, what I want that tape loop length to be at, essentially. And this is where I want to pan it in left-right space. And so with the panning, I can do exactly what Steve Reich did and have one going hard left and one going hard right, so I hear them coming out of different speakers. And then the contents of this function are fairly straightforward. And again, like I said, very similar to what we were doing with the musical palindrome. I'm initializing this position variable to be 1, and then I have this for loop. It's executing 32 times, so I'm going to go through this loop 32 times with a fit media command. It's putting it at on the track that I specified in my function parameter, starting at a position that's initialized to 1, but then I'm going to increment each time, and ending at position plus duration. Again, that duration being specified in the as a parameter of this function. And then I increment my position. And then I'm also calling setEffect to do the panning, setting it to a level that was determined, again, by the parameter I sent into the function. So now that I have this function, I can call it twice to do my two different tracks, my two different parts of my phasing. So the first one I'll put on track 1. I'll have it last exactly 2 measures for each loop, and I will have it be panned hard left, -100. The second one I'll put on track 2. I'll have it be slightly shorter, so 1.95 measures long instead of 2 full measures, and I'll have it panned hard right to +100. And then I can finish from there. So let's listen to this script in EarSketch now. So I've got this script loaded into my EarSketch text editor. I hit run script. And we can go ahead and listen to this phasing process unfold. Okay, there we go. So you can hear how they start off in sync with each other, but since one is slightly faster than the other, they start getting more and more and more out of sync with each other as the example goes on. Now, one of the cool things about abstracting this into a function is that I don't have to settle for just 2. I can play around and experiment with all different kinds of combinations here. So what if there were more than 2 tracks that were out of phase with each other? So I can just add another function call with different arguments, and I can add another one in. So say on track 3, I want something at 1.9 with a panning to the center. And I can even do more. On track 4, maybe 1.85 with a panning of -50. And on track 5, 1.8 with a panning of +50. So I've just typed in a few more lines of code, but I've created a very different result by having many layers phasing on top of each other. I'm going to go ahead and zoom that out so you can see all the tracks together here. And now we can listen to this with 5 different layers getting out of phase with each other. So you hear the very different kind of texture that arises when you have 5 voices instead of just 2. So what we've seen in this video is what process music is, and this notion of a gradual, perceptible process. We've looked at the music of Steve Reich, and particularly his concept of phasing, and then we've implemented this in Python, and we've defined our own function in order to make that much easier to create and to kind of explore variations on. The last approach we're going to talk about in the next video is style modeling.